Hi, I'm Maximilian Alvarez. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Real News Network and host of the podcast Working People. And this is the art of class war on Breaking Points. We've been hearing the same phrase for some time now. No one wants to work anymore. This time last year, mainstream media devoted breathless coverage and endless airtime to a ghoulish conga line of business owners, conservative politicians, and Chamber of Commerce bootlickers all coming to make baseless claims about how millions of people had just decided to be professional couch potatoes, and how workers today just don't have that can-do work ethic that they did back in the good old days. The no one wants to work narrative was an extremely lazy and convenient one for the business class and politicians to push at a time when workers, who had already been battered by a pandemic, a recession, and decades of stagnant wages and sky-high inequality, were finally standing up for themselves, quitting in record numbers, going on strike, unionizing, and just refusing to take crappy jobs where, they knew they would be treated poorly. And that narrative was regurgitated in state legislatures and used to justify terminating pandemic-era social safety provisions that had, for a small, all too brief time, lifted millions out of poverty. The order-giving class could not let that continue, so they worked overtime to kill it. Because for a moment, it revealed the dark truth at the heart of the whole capitalist enterprise, that this system needs an endless supply of workers who can be made desperate enough to be economically coerced into working at the bare minimum of dignity and security. And it also revealed that if working people do have a modicum of security with necessary public aid supporting them, they're going to do what they never felt they could when their survival depended on them staying quiet. They're going to push back. And that is exactly what workers did. We took one tiny step in that direction, and all of these rich dick politicians and their business buddies started flipping out. So they had to manufacture some sort of narrative to justify pushing working people back into the sewers, ripping away public aid, squashing the budding new unionization movement, jacking up prices on everything, etc., etc. It was convenient for business owners and corporate politicians to scapegoat workers as the problem, instead of asking themselves why workers were, refusing to accept their low pay, their degrading treatment, the unpredictable schedules, the lack of opportunities for stability and advancement, and so on. It was also easy to pathologize millions of workers and to speak on their behalf when workers themselves were never in the damn room and given a chance to talk back. And we all know how the corporate media, much like the elite political and business establishments, has no qualms about shutting workers out. Rather than workers having an actual seat at the table, the union busters at Starbucks literally have an empty chair at their corporate meetings that's supposed to represent the baristas whose rights they are currently violating. You really could not make up a better metaphor for how the people at the top of our economic hierarchy see the rest of us. And because workers are completely ignored, or at best reduced to tiny sound bites, it's easy to take a diverse and infinitely complex working class and boil it down to demeaning and offensive and untrue stereotypes. But when you actually listen to workers, you see very quickly that the reality in workplaces around the country looks much different than what bosses and boss-loving pundits depict in their self-serving op-eds and media appearances. If you, like me, have been relentlessly bombarded by these corporate media reports that only tell the boss's side of the story, you might reasonably think that the job market is just a hopeless wasteland of unanswered help wanted signs and lazy good-for-nothings who don't appreciate the value of an honest day's work. Of course, the most obvious problem with this framing is it completely ignores the millions and millions of people who are working and have been saying out loud and clearly for anyone who is willing to listen that the problem is coming from inside the house. For example, as someone who interviews workers for a living, one of the most consistent complaints that I have heard from workers across sectors is that cost-cutting, profit-motivated decisions handed down from management have created a crisis of deliberate understaffing and unpredictable staffing that is running workers into the ground, prompting many to leave, and making it harder for businesses to recruit and retain new staff. Recently, on my podcast, Working People, I spoke with Kenya Slaughter about the ridiculous conditions that dollar store workers like herself labor under on a daily basis. And as Kenya describes, during the pandemic and now with inflation, people are obviously looking to save money wherever they can, which is why you've seen dollar stores like Dollar General, Dollar Tree, and Family Dollar popping up everywhere. And these companies know what they're doing. They are targeting food deserts and low-income areas where residents may have no other good, close options for buying cheap groceries and household necessities. That also means that a lot of the stores are in areas with higher levels of crime. And this is why it was so shocking for me to hear Kenya describe Dollar General's corporate cost-cutting strategy of deliberately understaffing their stores, leaving workers overwhelmed, vulnerable, alone, and at risk. Take a listen.
Dollar General is still doing the same things. People are still working alone. The store is in a high volume, high crime area. They're strategically placed. They're always in food deserts all throughout the states. It's not just Louisiana, it's all over. So we all face the same problems with the stores in the high crime areas. So there's always the potential risk for someone, to come in and cut up. We have everything from, and excuse me, and if we need to take this part out, we can. But we have everything from people coming in the store, actually using the restroom like number 2 in the store, in the back stock room. Like that just happened a couple of weeks ago. We got a guy on camera who not only goes in our back stock room and does that, but then he leaves the stock room and commences to stealing and leaves the store with several items.
Jeez.
Now, during this time, there were 2 employees in the store, which is the norm, but one was stocking and one was on the register with a line. So no one, sees him because we're trying to get so much done. That's one of my main concerns with Dollar General. If we could be a little bit better staffed, I'm not even going to stretch and say security. Security is a stretch. They would have to pay them. And payment seems to be an issue. But if you could just pay more employees, give us more hours so that we could have 4 people on the floor. 3 minimum at all times. That way, no one ever has to be on the register alone. They would always have backup. Someone could always be constantly stocking. And then the third person can float. They can help between backing up the registers and helping stock and helping customers on the floor. No one should ever have to be alone. Being alone in the store is a hazard. I had my boss fall out this year. She literally passed out in the store and had to be taken from the ambulance. She had some health issues and she was in the store alone because we don't have the man hours to give people the shifts that are required to run the store smoothly. Quick math, Max. My store requires 91 hours to operate with just one person on the cash register from Sunday to Sunday, okay? So that's 91 hours just for anybody during any shift to be on the register. If we're only allotted 135 hours, 140 hours, somebody's going to come up short somewhere. Someone's always going to be alone at some point in time. The bare minimum should be 180 hours. That way, 2 people can be in the store at all times.
Think of Kenya the next time you hear someone saying that no one wants to work anymore these days. She and her coworkers are begging Dollar General for more hours and more staff, which the billion-dollar company can certainly afford. But companies like Dollar General are run by people with business degrees, sitting in air-conditioned corporate headquarters somewhere, making top-down managerial decisions that look great on a spreadsheet, but look very different for the workers who make their business run. Now, that's just one example. But, in a deeply unsettling way, I started to realize how familiar the situation that Kenya was describing to me sounded. Here, for instance, is a clip from an interview I did at The Real News with Karin, an education support professional who has worked in the Minneapolis school district for 6 years. In March of this year, 4,500 educators with the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers went on strike, demanding smaller class sizes, better pay and benefits, more mental health resources for students, and increased workforce diversity. Listen to the first thing that Karin notes when I asked her to describe the situation she and her fellow educators have been facing during and even before the pandemic.
One thing that I've seen throughout my 6 years here is that we're chronically understaffed. That's been true the entire time I've been here. There are hundreds of ESP openings where we have lost tons and tons of teachers over the last 2 years, but there were always openings. I was in a position, I worked for the EBD program, which is emotional behavioral. So there were supposed to be 3 of me, and there was just 1. And that was just one part of our program at that school. So that meant that I didn't have time to address all of the kids that I was supposed to be working with. I never knew what my schedule was going to be on a daily basis because it was just putting out fires. And it created actual dangerous conditions. I have a little bit of PTSD from that job because at least every 2 weeks I was put in situations where I was breaking up fights where I could have gotten very hurt. And I know other ESPs that have gotten very hurt doing those jobs. If there were more ESPs, more SEAs available to help do that work, we wouldn't have been in those dangerous conditions. And that was before the pandemic. And it saves the district money to have those positions unfilled because that's a position that they don't have to pay money for. So there's not a lot of incentive for them to go out and recruit people.
Now let's move over to healthcare. Last year, over 700 nurses at St. Vincent Hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts, waged the longest nurses' strike in the state's history. And they were striking against Tenet Healthcare, the Dallas-based investor-owned healthcare giant that owns St. Vincent Hospital. At the center of the strike were workers' concerns about working conditions and staffing, specifically the unmanageable nurse-to-patient ratio that nurses, represented by the Massachusetts Nurses Association, say make it difficult to provide safe and sufficient care to every patient, which every nurse wants to do. That is their job. And over at The Real News, we recently published a really important oral history of the strike told by the people who lived it. Listen to this clip with Julie Pinkham, the executive director for the Massachusetts Nurses Association, and see if what she says sounds familiar.
It's not just Massachusetts, it's not just St. Vincent's, it's everywhere. We're hearing the issue of nurses facing staffing issues. We have this just-in-time staffing, and there's this casualization of the workforce where you want everybody sort of part-time or per diem so you can push them into a slot as you need it, but not otherwise there, whereas previously you would have a lot more full-timers, which gave you the luxury of continuity at the bedside. Generally, I always find that management tends to use the word flexibility. And, the converse of flexibility for management usually is control. We want the control of determining when and if something happens. But ultimately, it's the nurse that's taking care of the patient, and it's him or her that's license is on the line in their decision-making. And they really are the experts right there to know whether or not they can achieve the outcomes that they need to with the patient population based on how sick they are and how much resources they need of each other to make that happen. Management would, like to make it as slim and as they can, because it's resources means more pay. Having people staffing, is more money out of their pocket. But at the end of the day, it's the difference between patients doing well and not doing well.
Listen, this is not an isolated issue. Understaffing and unpredictable staffing is a cost-cutting, labor-disciplining plague that is affecting workers all over the country. In retail, education, service work, healthcare, and even in manufacturing and logistics. I mean, we've been hearing constant reports about supply chain issues caused by the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, extreme weather events exacerbated by climate change, and of course, these world events have caused massive disruptions. But if you talk to folks working on the railroads, for instance, particularly in the freight service, you'll hear how corporate greed and cost-cutting, profit-juicing measures handed down from corporate executives like Katie Farmer and Warren Buffett have brought the railroads to a grinding halt. That's the supply chain crisis that no one is talking about right now. And a lot of it comes down to deliberate and chronic understaffing. I mean, if you live near a rail line, you may have noticed that the freight trains have been getting longer and heavier over the years. And that's not your imagination, they actually have. What you may not know, though, is that those trains used to have crews of like 4 or 5 people working them. But over the years, long before the pandemic, companies like BNSF Railway and Union Pacific have done the same thing that hospitals and schools and dollar stores have done. They piled more work onto fewer people, forcing workers to adhere to impossibly brutal schedules, using draconian attendance policies, reducing those train crews down to 2 workers. And as we speak, they are trying to achieve their long-desired goal of having just 1 person operate those mile-long trains. The railroad employees and former employees that I talk to keep telling me that workers are leaving in record numbers, that the supply chain is a mess, and no one in these companies is being held accountable, no one at the top at least. Here's Ron Kamenko, an Amtrak engineer in Reno who is currently serving as General Secretary of Railroad Workers United, in an interview we published at The Real News in May.
Recruitment. The railroads are having a hell of a time recruiting new employees and retaining the ones they have. But once again, what we see is the industry, which is basically saying, to hell with the unions. You're going to pay bigger copays and deductibles in healthcare. We're going to get rid of the conductor. We want massive changes in work rules for all the different crafts. And so this is hardly an industry that is serious about retaining and recruiting if they're attempting to make our lives worse. And anyone coming into the industry is getting this message. In the old days, the way the railroads recruited was largely through networks of existing employees, sons and daughters, brothers and cousins, and friends of theirs in the neighborhood and stuff. That's how the word got out. And the railroad was a good job, so they never really had problems retaining and recruiting. Now that they do, they are actually making it worse because this network is gone. People are not advising their children to get jobs on the railroad. They're not advising their friends and neighbors or others that they're aware of who need a good job. I myself, in good conscience, find it very, very difficult. And for years, I advocated people go to work on the railroad, particularly in the freight service. And now I can't, in good conscience, without the caveat that be prepared for this, 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 and this, advise a railroad job to anybody. It's so sad.
Don't give me this no one wants to work crap. If you want people to come work at your shitty company and devote their lives to making your business run, then stop treating them like this. These are good, hardworking people trying to make a living for themselves and their families. Any employer should count themselves lucky to have employees like Kenya Slaughter, Karin, Julie Pinkham, and Ron Kamenko. You are not entitled to our labor. You need us to function, which is why you try to keep us down and broken and disorganized so that we are forced to work with you. And we know that you're scared right now, that people are waking up and fighting back together. And you know what? You should be. Thank you for watching this segment with Breaking Points, and be sure to subscribe to my news outlet, The Real News, with links in the description. See y'all soon for the next edition of The Art of Class War. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and solidarity forever.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.